We're reading from Evernight by Ross Mackenzie, and we're reading the 17th chapter, which is also called The Evernight. Mrs. Hester killed 3 of her white witches on the way back to the palace, turning their insides to fire so that they died writhing and screaming. Her own insides were ablaze with fury and hatred. This morning was supposed to have been a show of strength, a way of frightening her white witches away from any thoughts of freedom. Instead, the hags had humiliated her and made her look weak. Worse than that, they had made Mrs. Hester doubt herself, something she had never done before. How many mistakes had she made? How many white witches had she left with traces of their soul inside them? After the horror show earlier, she supposed that more of them than ever would now be dreaming of escape. She could not have that, could not tolerate it. The king was already becoming agitated. If the oaf decided to get rid of her, she'd have no choice but to kill him, and that would make everything so much more complicated. No, she would not let her plans, her life's work, dissolve before her eyes. She needed to finish the Westerly witches and control the mother tree so that she could breathe magic straight from its blossom. She stormed up her tower, kicked open the doors, and threw a few spell bottles shattering against the wall. Then she grabbed the urn and unstoppered it. When Shadow Jack appeared at Mrs. Hester's side, he looked at her hate-filled face. "Why do I get the feeling I've missed something?" he said. "I want it done." "What?" "I want the Evernight released. Now." "Now? Do you think that's a good idea? We don't have the Doomsday spell yet." "Well, that won't be a problem for very much longer, according to you." "Even so, it would be better to wait if you release the Evernight without the means to put it back in." "No, I'm sick of waiting. It has to be now." She rounded on him, her face lit harshly by her wand, and saw a strange, livid madness in her eyes. "The hags made a fool of me in front of the entire city, made me look weak in the eyes of my own white witches. I won't have it any more. I want them to die, all of them, and when the Evernight comes for them, I want them to know it was Mrs. Hester who brought it to their door. Now take me to it." "Now? Don't you want to rest first? It's 2 days' flight." "No, I don't want to fly. I want you to get me there by other means. The Djinn way." Shadow Jack shook his head. "It'll kill you." "A lot of things should have killed me long before now. I'm a tough old bird. Do it." Shadow Jack stepped close, wrapped his arms around her. They stood for a moment in an awkward embrace, and then a swirl of darkness cocooned them. When the cocoon fell away, they stood on the edge of a black lake under a midnight sky bursting with stars. The air was freezing, the world twinkling under a coat of crystal frost. In the centre of the lake was a small rocky island. Mrs. Hester knew this place well. Shadow Jack had brought her here many times inside her mind. Her head spun, and the stars danced and streaked through the sky. She dropped to her knees, gasping, threw up, and saw that her vomit was streaked with blood. Shadow Jack tried to help her up, but she pushed him away and climbed to her unsteady feet. "I felt like I was broken up in a million little pieces and then put back together again." Shadow Jack nodded. Mrs. Hester pointed at him. "Well, you've better have put everything back in the right place. What is it? What are you looking at?" "You're a little older," said Shadow Jack. Mrs. Hester peered at her hands and saw that the youthful, milky skin had thinned. She went to the lake, loaded a light spell into her wand, and looked at her reflection in the still water. Her eyes were framed with crow's feet, and there were lines on her forehead. Streaks of grey had crept through her hair. The youth she had stolen from the young lady in the tower was already fading. no doubt due to the strength it had taken to survive the journey here. Years ago, she'd have handled it easily, but now she was getting so damned old, and keeping all those white witches' souls took up so much of her power. She needed to set things in motion now, before it was too late for her. For the longest time she had lived so far from the mother tree, using only the magic that the blossom trees breathed into the air, magic that had been carried around the world and diluted. Imagine what she could do if she controlled the source of the magic. Imagine if she could walk among the blossom again and feel it all around her. Mrs. Hester dug in her pockets, loaded another bottle into the revolver chamber of her wand, and fired the spell at the lake. Where the spell hit the water, a thin bridge of ice formed, cracking and popping. It stretched all the way out to the crag of rock in the centre. Mrs. Hester ran out over the ice bridge and onto the tiny island, Shadow Jack at her heels, and began to climb the steep, jutting rock. Where is it? I don't know exactly, just that it's here. This hagging coat! Mrs. Hester's long coat had snagged on the rock, sending several spell bottles clinking into the quiet darkness. Never mind that. Look! They scrambled further up. The crag was much bigger than it had seemed from the ground, and they were around halfway to the sharp summit, on a ledge and a dark entrance. Breathing heavily, Mrs. Hester took her wand and loaded another light spell. The brightness of it stabbed at her eyes, but she did not care. She swept to the entrance, held out her wand, peered into the cave. Steps! Come on! There were indeed steps, lots of them, carved roughly into the rock, all different heights and awkward angles. The steps took Mrs. Hester and Shadow Jack down into the earth, to a chamber far beneath the lake and the island. The air was stale and sour and damp, and when Mrs. Hester put out a hand to lean on the cave walls, she recoiled at the slimy touch of it. What's that noise? From the blackness beyond the reach of Mrs. Hester's light came the unmistakable rhythmic sound of breathing. Who's there? She turned to Shadow Jack. Who's in here? I don't know. Mrs. Hester took a few spells from the remaining pockets of her coat, loaded them into the chambers of her wand. Her eyes flickered around the place as she crept further into the chamber. Eventually she stopped, tilted her head and peered hard into the gloom as if making sure what she was seeing was real. In the very corner of the chamber, sitting in a wooden chair, was an old man. Presently he was asleep. His beard was so wild and his hair so long that his face was barely visible. Somewhere in the matted tangle of his dirty whiskers, his mouth hung open. He was dressed in a long leather witch's coat, and on his lap was a beautifully crafted wand with an ornate silver revolver chamber. Mrs. Hester looked at Shadow Jack. Shadow Jack shrugged. Mrs. Hester noticed, motioned for him to step aside, and he melted away into the shadows. Then Mrs. Hester moved forward, quickly swiped the wand from the old man's lap, and kicked him in the shin. He started awake, looking around in a bewildered sort of way, then saw Mrs. Hester standing over him and tried to jump up. But he was so old that he could only climb slowly from the chair, and by the time he was on his feet, he seemed quite exhausted. Who are you? Mrs. Hester asked him. He opened his mouth and said, Flachekensle floop. Mrs. Hester stared blankly at him. What? Lonky yop doodlepip. Come again? Said Mrs. Hester. The old man shook his head violently. He put a finger in his ear, wiggled it around, and made the sort of noise a person can only make when they are trying to scratch an itch somewhere in the middle of their brain. Fwa hanigra, he blinked. I'm sorry, I haven't spoken for... Oh, it must be coming on for 900 years now. I'd rather forgotten how. He straightened up as best he could and said in a surprisingly deep and commanding voice, "Why have you come?" Mrs. Hester tried to be calm, though her heart was thundering. "For the Evernight, of course." The old man looked very grave. "Who are you?" "My name is Mrs. Hester. I am the leader of all White Witches." "White Witch? What's a White Witch?" "The world has changed a lot since you came here," said Mrs. Hester. "There was a civil war between two factions of witches. Now there are the hags, who claim Westerly Witch, and the White Witches, who wish to possess it." "Well, I'm not concerned about hags or White Witches," said the old man. "I am only worried about the Evernight." His expression became haunted, and his eyes seemed to sink further into his deep sockets. "You can't imagine how strong it is. They say Lady Light herself locked it away in the underworld during the War of the Gods. Then, when we witches unwittingly let it out 1,000 years ago, it was up to Sam Hawke, the greatest High Witch there ever was, to put it back. Well, after that, he sent me to keep watch, to make sure the Evernight stayed trapped beneath the earth. That's what I've done, and that's what I'll do until I take my last breath." Shadow Jack stepped into the spell-light. The old witch stared up at him, and then at the floor, where he cast no shadow. "The genie," he said in a harsh whisper. "A real genie?" Mrs. Hester took the old man's wand and snapped it over her knee. He put his hand to his chest and wailed. "Don't do it! If you let the Evernight out, it'll eat up all the goodness and light and happiness in existence. You have no idea how strong it is, what it can do. You won't be able to take it back." Mrs. Hester leaned over and planted a kiss on his forehead. "You've earned a rest, I think. Sleep tight." She nodded to Shadow Jack, who took out his blade. A moment later, the old man, the witch who had once been the strongest of his kind, who had stayed faithfully at his post for almost 1,000 years, was dead. At the final beat of the old man's heart, a deep rumble shook the island. Mrs. Hester and Shadow Jack stumbled around as chunks of rock fell from the ceiling and shattered. Beneath their feet, the dust of 1,000 years scattered to reveal a circular seal on the ground, a ring of interlocking branches, and in the centre, a bird in flight. When the rumbling died away, Mrs. Hester stood at the edge of the great seal. "Are you sure?" said Shadow Jack. Mrs. Hester tried to still her hands. She could feel the coursing power of something ancient beneath her feet, and for the first time she could remember, she was frightened. But a great fear spurred her on, the fear of losing power. Her hatred for the hags, for the king, her embarrassment at being made to look weak in front of her White Witches, had lit a fire in her mind, burning away the last traces of reason. She only wanted the hags to suffer, only wanted to have the Mother Tree all to herself, only wanted to watch the Evernight strangle the last breath of life from the High Witch. She took her wand and touched the tip to the seal. At once the etchings glowed bright, and the cavern rumbled and shook. But the power was white hot and stabbing in Mrs. Hester's veins, and she screamed. The enchantment took her up and tossed her away. Oof! She landed heavily, losing the grip on her wand. Shadow Jack's hurrying footsteps approached, and he helped her up and guided her wand back into her hand. She lit the place and looked at her scorched fingertips, noticing the smooth skin of her hands had become thin and wrinkled. "It's too strong," she managed to say, hardly believing her own words. "I'm too old." A pause. "Stand back," said Shadow Jack. He walked to the centre of the seal. He stamped his foot and crouched down. and ran his finger across some of the inscriptions Sam Hawke had made so long ago. He tasted his finger, tasted the magic, and he nodded and stood up and became the raven, soaring up to the roof of the great chamber. Mrs. Hester held out her wand, and at the edges of her spell light she saw him tuck in his wings and dive. In a short distance he picked up incredible speed, and when he hit the ground he went crashing through the centre of the seal, leaving a rough hole from which vicious, smoking black liquid began to spit. Mrs. Hester stepped back, her eyes full moons. A rumbling growl shook the ground, passed through her body and made her knees buckle. The seal exploded fully open from beneath, depositing Shadow Jack on the ground. He was a man once more, and he stumbled up, covered in the black liquid, wiping it from his eyes, spitting and hacking it from his throat. "We have to go!" Mrs. Hester did not argue. They rushed out of the chamber, the walls crumbling around them, up the staircase and out into the clear night of the dark side of the world. Half falling, they stumbled down the crag, and as they ran across the ice bridge, the top of the island exploded, raining hot rubble and ash down upon them, making the ice melt and crack at their feet. When they made it back to the land, they turned to see fire coming from the open rock, livid orange flames licking up from a place Mrs. Hester could only imagine. A thin, spidery crack crept down the island of rock. As the crack reached the lake, a thunderous roar filled the darkness, and the ground deep beneath the surface of the lake tore open, causing the water to churn and bubble as it drained away. Soon the lake was dry, and on its exposed bed strange, dark-dwelling fish flapped and flopped, suffocating. From the crack in the lake bed came another screaming roar. An inky, smoky substance geezered up towards the stars, where it gathered and tumbled and snaked in the air, growing, blooming, a nightmarish mixture of substantial and insubstantial matter, of shadow and putrid stinking gas, of fear and death and hatred, lit from within by flashes of crackling lightning. The Evernight had awakened. Deep in the mountains and corners of these midnight lands, tribes of dark creatures had slept for almost 1,000 years. Now, as the Evernight began to stir, so too did its people, rising from slumber, the markings on their skin glowing with the crackling power of reborn dark magic. They began to trek towards the lake. The painted were on the move.